All right, continuing on to section 5 in Algebra 1, chapter 10, we're looking at completing the square. Now, completing the square is another method of solving for our zeros of a parabola, of a quadratic. So we've talked about how to do it if there's no b value, so where you just solve for x, essentially doing a square root. We've talked about how to factor and solve, and now we're going to look at this section and when we talk about the quadratic formula, how to solve it if you can't factor it. If you have a bx value and you can't factor the function, okay, we can still solve those, and this is one of the methods. This method actually is used to find the quadratic formula. Okay, so there's going to be both methods. Whichever one you feel more comfortable with is going to be the one that you're probably going to be using more often, and it's probably going to be the quadratic formula. But let's go over completing the square so you can see how this is done. So basically with completing the square, what you're trying to do is you're trying to turn your equation to look something like this. X plus b over 2, that whole thing squared. So you're trying to turn a whole function into a binomial that's being squared. And so what you'd have to do with this is you'd end up having to add numbers back and forth. But looking at this, so what we want to do is the way to turn a trinomial into that binomial is to look at the b value, divide it in half, and then square it. So if we take 6, half of 6 is 3, 3 squared is 9. That means that we can write that as a binomial that's being squared. So we can rewrite that as x plus 3, that whole thing squared. Okay, because if we take the b value, cut it in half, and then square it, we end up getting 9. We get that number. So now if we look at the next example here on the right, our b value is 10. Half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. We're wanting 100. So that means that we can't just convert that trinomial into a binomial. Okay, so we have to do an extra step for it. We're going to discuss what that extra step is. But the goal is to try to turn that trinomial into a binomial that's being squared. Okay, that's kind of the goal that we're going for. So let's say we have these and we want to solve them. So this first one we did previously, and we saw that it worked. So we take our b value, cut it in half, and then we square it, which gets us 9. Okay, which is what we want. Which means we can take this and we can convert it into x plus 3, that whole thing squared, is equal to 1. Okay. So again, that's our goal, is to convert it into that binomial. Now, once we get it down here, we have to solve for x. Well, what do we do to solve for x? We have to get rid of that squared first, which means we're going to take the square root of both sides. And when we take the square root of both sides, that squared disappears, leaving us with x plus 3 is equal to the plus or minus 1. So remember, when you take the square root of a number, you have to do plus and minus. You're going to have 2. And now you have x plus 3 is equal to 1. You want to get the x by itself, so you would subtract 3 on both sides. And so we would write it as -2 or -4, because we would end up with -3 plus 1 and -3 minus 1. Okay, because that's what that plus or minus means. Okay. All right, so now looking at this one on the right hand side, if we take this 1/2, or this 2 over 2 squared, does that get us 1? Yes, it does. So that means we can convert this one, which means we can convert it as x minus 1, because this sign is negative. So since that's a minus, the other one's going to also be a minus. So x minus 1 squared is equal to 4. And now we go through the same process. Take the square root of both sides. Getting us x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus 2. Okay, so like what's shown there. Okay, and then we move that 1 to the other side. So we're going to add 1 to positive 2 and add 1 to negative 2. When we add them together, we get negative 1 and 3. So we end up with our 2 answers. Okay, so you want to simplify it down. Now, sometimes these will not end up being nice round numbers. Okay, so now let's talk about if it doesn't work out and we have to do something extra. So let's say we take this problem and we want to do that same completing the square process. So we take the middle number, it'd be 4. 4 over 2, that whole thing squared. That gets us a positive 4. Well, we have a negative 4. Since that's not the same, what we're going to do is we're going to move that 4 to the other side. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. Okay. Now, once we get it down to there, we're going to add what we would call a trivial 0. Now, remember, zeros are anything added to 0 doesn't change it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 4 to both sides. Okay? Because if we were to move one of those 4s to the other side, we end up with 0, getting our trivial 0. So we're going to take our calculated number here and we're going to add it to both sides of this equation. Okay? And when we do that, we end up with x squared plus 4x plus 4 is equal to 4 plus 4. Now we simplify the right-hand side, getting us 8. And then the left-hand side, we can use our binomial, that trinomial to binomial process that we've done in the previous slides. Because now this over 2 squared is equal to this number. So now we can change it. So you see down here it says add b over 2 squared to both sides, which is the 4 that we've added to both. So now I've used my completing the square. I've turned it into a square, which is x plus 2. That whole thing squared is equal to 8, because 4 plus 4 is 8. And now I go through and I solve it like what I've done previously. Take the square root of both sides and get my number. Now, as you see here, I end up with a radical. And so you could use your calculator, round your answers to the nearest thousandths or so. So it ended up being negative 2 plus the square root of 8 and negative 2 minus the square root of 8. Okay, so those would end up being our 2 answers more expanded, and then we'd use a calculator to calculate each one if we wanted the decimal. Okay, so you wouldn't have to write it in exact form if you don't want to. Okay, so now let's look at this one. So if we work through this one, we would see that we end up with a, if we tested it out, we get negative 2 over 2, and that whole thing squared. We end up with a positive 1. We have a negative 1, which isn't the same. So that means we would have to add 1 to both sides. Okay, so we're going to move this 1, and then we're going to add 1 to both sides. Okay, and this are those 2 right there, okay, that we've added. Now this, the left-hand side, can now turn into x minus 1, that whole thing squared, okay, using our completion of the square, which is going to be x plus b over 2. Okay. So now we can rewrite it, so it's x minus 1 squared is equal to 2. And now we go through and we solve it, taking the square root of the left and right hand side, getting us plus or minus root 2, and then we're going to add 1. So we end up with 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. Okay, and that's how we get our completion of the square. Again, you can use decimals for your answers. Okay, so looking at this one, now we have a number in front of the a. Now this was different than the previous ones where we've just had x squared. Now we have 2x squared. Now the easiest way of doing this is just to divide everything by that coefficient. So whatever that coefficient is, whatever that number is in front of the x squared, so in this case 2, divide everything by 2. Now we do end up getting a fraction. We get 1/2, but that doesn't stop us. So now we have x squared plus 1/2 x equals 3. The reason for this is because if you wanted to keep that 2a, or that a is 2, you have to go through kind of a slightly different process than what we have been doing. So this will make it a little bit easier because then we can just keep doing our same things. So divide whatever that a value was throughout everything. And now we do the same thing. So we go 1/2 all over 2, and we square it. Okay. Now, when we take 1/2 divided by 2, we get 1/4. When we square it, we get 1/16. So now we add 1/16 to both sides. So we end up with x squared plus 1/2 x plus 1/16 is equal to 3 plus 1/16. And now this turns into x plus 1/2 all over 2, which is 1/4, and then we square that whole thing. Okay, and so we have x plus 1/4 squared is equal to, and then 49 over 16, what I did was I just converted this into an improper fraction, which I recommend doing because it's going to be easier if you have to do the square root of 49 over 16 than 3 and 1/16. And so now we go through and we do our square root. So we do the square root of both sides, end up with x plus 1/4 is equal to plus or minus 7 over 4 because we took the square root of the top and the bottom. And now we subtract 1/4, giving us either a positive 6 over 4, which is 3 over 2, or we have a negative 8 over 4, which is a negative 2. Okay, so if you have a number in front of that a value, or if you have a number for the a value that's not 1, just divide everything by whatever that a value is, and then go through your normal process of your completion of the square. Okay, so take a second, work through this one, see if you can get the answer, and then we'll step through it. All right, so with this one, we notice that we have our we have it kind of set up for us already. So now we have to go our negative 3 over 2, and we're squaring that, which gets us 9 over 4. So that means we're going to add 9 over 4 to both sides. So we're left with x squared minus 3x plus 9 over 4 is equal to 28 plus 9 over 4. Okay. Now this left-hand side ends up becoming just x minus 3 over 2, that whole thing squared. Okay. Because it's always going to be whatever's inside the parenthesis. It's always x and then whatever's inside that parenthesis right there. Okay, that's always, always, always when we've done this correctly. The other side gets us a, I'm just going to put it as a decimal, gets us a 30.25. And now we're going to take the square root of both sides. So let's move over to a different color. Green. So now we do the square root of both sides. Now I'm not going to put the decimal, I'm just going to keep it in terms of the square root. So now we have x minus 3 over 2 is equal to plus or minus 30.25. And then we would add 3 over 2 to both sides. So we would end up, oh, this is a square root of 30.25. So now for our answers, okay, in decimal form, so we end up with 7 and negative 4. And those would be our answers. All right. So those would be our answers. And yeah, so that's completion of the square. Now again, it is a complicated process. We're going to go through another one which you might like more next. But it is a process that is used to create the formula that we're going to use, the quadratic formula that we're going to learn next. Okay, there's your homework, is in section 5.